August 1874, western Kansas. A homesteading farmer named Elias Thorne stands in the center of a dying field. He is 42 years old, but the sun and the wind have carved lines into his face that make him look 60. In his calloused hand, he holds a single, shriveled stalk of blue grama grass. This thin, wiry plant was supposed to be the gold of the prairie, the fuel for the Great Plains cattle engine. But today, the grass is gray and brittle. A heat wave has gripped the territory for 3 months, turning the soil into a fine, choking powder. Elias looks at his 3 gaunt cows and then at the horizon. A strange, dark cloud is moving toward him from the west. It is not a rain cloud. It is a literal wall of shimmering wings. Millions of Rocky Mountain locusts are descending to eat every green thing left in sight. Elias knows that if the grass dies, his family dies with it. For decades, we have been told that the West was won with the Colt revolver and the Winchester rifle. We see images of lawmen and outlaws facing off in dusty streets. But the real war for the American frontier was fought over something much quieter. It was a war of the soil, the seed, and the stomach. The conquest of the West was dictated by what could grow and what was allowed to live. There was a secret botanical struggle happening beneath the boots of the cavalry and the hooves of the buffalo. Some plants were seen as salvation, while others were branded as a curse by the government. One specific plant, often called Indian grass or the devil's ribbon, became the center of a silent conflict. It saved thousands of lives during the Great Famine of the Plains, yet the authorities tried to burn it out of existence. What happened to Elias Thorne and his secret patch of forbidden greens changed the fate of his county forever. The truth about how food, not lead, settled the frontier is a story rarely told. What happened next changed everything. By the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation obsessed with the horizon. The Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail were the primary arteries of this expansion. Between 1840 and 1860, nearly 400,000 people packed their lives into covered wagons. They were chasing a dream of fertile black soil and endless pastures. However, the reality of the Great American Desert was a brutal shock to those from the lush, rainy East. The settlers moved through Missouri and Kansas, heading toward the rugged territories of New Mexico and Arizona. They brought with them seeds from Europe and the East Coast. They brought wheat, corn, and rye, expecting the earth to submit to their familiar tools. But the West was not a garden. It was a complex, ancient ecosystem. The prices for basic survival were staggering during the peak migration years. In 1850, a single sack of flour could cost $15 in a remote outpost, roughly $500 in today's currency. Salt, which was essential for preserving meat and keeping livestock healthy, was often worth its weight in silver. If a wagon's salt supply was lost in a river crossing, it was often a death sentence for the trek. The settlers were competing for these meager resources with the established nations of the plains. The Comanche, the Navajo, and the Pawnee had lived on these lands for centuries. They understood the rhythms of the drought and the hidden bounty of the weeds. To the tribes, the prairie was a vast, open larder filled with nutrient-dense roots and hardy stalks. To the settlers, any plant they didn't recognize was an enemy to be plowed under. This cultural clash wasn't just about land ownership. It was about the philosophy of the garden. The United States government wanted a West that looked like an orderly grid of wheat fields and fenced cattle ranches. They viewed the nomadic lifestyle and the diverse native flora as an obstacle to progress. The rails were pushing westward, bringing the iron horse and more mouths to feed. But as the iron rails expanded, the natural balance of the plains began to collapse. The buffalo were disappearing, and the native grasses that had held the soil together for millennia were being replaced by fragile eastern crops. By the late 1860s, the stage was set for a massive environmental disaster. The oasis of the West was about to become a dust bowl of starvation, and the only hope for survival lay in the very plants the settlers were told to despise. The summer of 1871 brought a drought so severe that the Rio Grande in some sections became a mere trickle of mud. In the territory of New Mexico, the sheep and cattle industry was the lifeblood of the economy. But without rain, the grass simply stopped growing. Panic began to spread among the ranchers. At Fort Union, a major military supply hub, the officers grew concerned as their horses began to weaken and die from sand colic. The animals were so desperate for fodder that they were eating dirt and pebbles just to fill their stomachs. The Army's official response was rigid. They issued orders to maintain standardized foraging, forbidding soldiers from using local plants that hadn't been approved by government botanists back east. In July of that year, a local newspaper, the Santa Fe Gazette, published a desperate plea. Quote, "Our animals are perishing before our eyes, and the government holds our hands while the dust fills our throats." Amidst this crisis, a controversy erupted over a plant known as purslane, or what the locals called verdolaga. To the refined eyes of the government land agents, this low-growing, succulent plant was a vile weed that signaled a lazy farmer. They believed it choked out the civilized crops. In several townships, ordinances were actually passed that fined farmers if they allowed this wild growth to take over their plots. They were ordered to burn it, even as their own children suffered from the early signs of scurvy due to a lack of fresh greens. The escalation turned into a shadow war. While the authorities demanded that the land be cleared for productive agriculture, the starving settlers began to notice something. The Native American tribes in the region remained remarkably healthy despite the lack of rain. They weren't fighting the drought. They were harvesting it. A secret trade began to emerge at night. Settlers would trade precious metal buttons or cloth for small bags of dried green leaves and seeds that the government had labeled as trash. This was the Garden War of the 1870s. On one side were the officials, who wanted to control the food supply through railroads and eastern seeds. On the other side were the people who realized that to survive the Wild West, they had to start thinking like the people who had lived there for 1,000 years. The tension reached a breaking point when a government agent in Kansas ordered the public burning of a massive cache of harvested Indian grass seeds, claiming they were a biological nuisance to the local wheat industry. The fire at the Kansas seed cache didn't just burn the plants, it scorched the hope of 500 families. By October 1874, the situation for Elias Thorne and his neighbors reached a lethal peak. They were 300 miles from the nearest functioning railhead. The locusts had finished what the drought started, leaving the landscape looking like a charred moonscape. There was no flour left in the Thorne house. Elias's youngest daughter, Sarah, was 6 years old. She was too weak to stand, her gums bleeding. A classic symptom of vitamin deficiency that plagued the frontier. Elias knew of a hidden ravine 10 miles to the south, a place the local tribes called the Cradle of the Sun. It was a microclimate where a specific, hardy tuber and a thick, moisture-retaining moss grew in the shadows of the limestone cliffs. But there was a problem. The land had been cordoned off by a powerful cattle syndicate that used the ravine as a private waterhole. They had posted armed guards to keep squatters out. Elias didn't have a choice. He took his last horse, a mare so thin her ribs looked like a washboard, and rode out under the cover of a moonless night. The air was thick with the smell of dry sage and the distant metallic scent of a coming dust storm. As Elias approached the ravine, the sound of the wind through the dry scrub sounded like 1,000 whispering voices. He could hear the heavy boots of the guards pacing above the rim. He had to crawl on his belly through the jagged rocks, his fingers bleeding as he searched for the specific serrated leaves of the wild forage. Every snap of a dry twig sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the prairie. He found the patch, a small, resilient cluster of green in a world of brown. He dug frantically with his bare hands, the soil under the rocks still holding a ghost of moisture. Just as he filled his sack, a lantern flared above him. "Who's there?" a voice boomed. Elias froze. If he was caught, he would be charged with trespassing and theft of private resources. The guards fired a warning shot that echoed through the canyon walls. Elias scrambled into the darkness, clutching the sack of weeds to his chest like it was a bag of gold. He didn't know if the plants would save Sarah, but he knew they were the only thing between his family and a shallow grave in the dust. Elias Thorne returned to his homestead before the sun could expose his tracks. He didn't have a medical degree or a chemistry set. He only had the desperate instructions whispered to him by a Kiowa trader months earlier. He took the roots, washed them with a precious pint of water, and began to prepare a thick, earthy mash. He watched his daughter's face as she took the first bitter spoonful. On the frontier, the line between medicine and food was non-existent. For the next 3 days, the Thorne family lived on nothing but this wild forage and the few scraps of dried meat they had left. Slowly, the color returned to Sarah's cheeks. The bleeding in her gums stopped. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply the power of a plant that was evolutionarily designed to thrive where wheat had failed. But while the Thornes found a temporary reprieve, the rest of the territory was descending into a different kind of darkness. As the news of the secret forage spread, it didn't bring people together. It created a fierce, dangerous competition. In the spring of 1875, a second figure entered this botanical drama. Margaret "Ma" Sullivan, a widow running a small roadhouse along the Santa Fe Trail in New Mexico. Margaret was a woman who had buried a husband and 2 sons in the red dirt. She had survived by watching the animals. She noticed that the wild cattle, those that had escaped the fenced ranches, remained fat and healthy even when the grass turned to dust. They were eating the pods of the mesquite tree and the fruit of the prickly pear cactus. Margaret began to harvest these pest plants and serve them to the weary travelers and cowboys passing through her station. But her success drew the ire of the local land speculators. These were men who had invested heavily in the Great Wheat Hope. They saw the use of native plants as a threat to their business model. If people could survive on what grew for free in the ditches, they wouldn't need to buy expensive imported grain from the company stores. Letters from this period reveal the mounting tension. One diary entry from a neighboring farmer reads, quote, "The bank agents came by today. They told us if we were caught foraging like savages, instead of planting the government-allotted seed, our loans would be called in. They want us to starve on our knees rather than stand up with a full stomach of wild greens." This was the conflict of the furrow. The railroad companies and the banks needed the settlers to be dependent on the supply chain. Every time a woman like Margaret Sullivan showed a neighbor how to dry and grind mesquite beans into flour, she was committing an act of economic rebellion. The knowledge of the Wild West garden was becoming a form of resistance. The authorities began to spread rumors that these native plants were toxic, claiming they caused prairie madness or permanent stunted growth. They used fear to keep the settlers tied to the dying wheat fields. But as the cattle started dying by the thousands in the Great Blizzard of 1876, the official way of life was about to face its ultimate test. The winter of 1876-1877 is still whispered about in the history of the High Plains. It started with a deceptively warm November, followed by a blue norther that dropped temperatures 60 degrees in a matter of hours. This wasn't just weather. It was a tectonic shift in the survival of the West. The standard cattle breeds, The shorthorns and the eastern varieties weren't built for this. Their thick coats weren't enough when the grass was buried under 4 feet of ice-crusted snow. At the Sullivan Roadhouse, Margaret found herself trapped with 25 stranded cowboys and a dozen travelers. The supply wagons from the east were stuck in snowdrifts 300 miles away. The pantry was nearly empty. The men were eyeing the leather of their own boots, a grim sign of the final stages of starvation. This was the moment the rules of the frontier changed forever. Margaret Sullivan walked into the common room and threw a heavy burlap sack onto the table. It was filled with the dark, sweet-smelling pods she had spent all summer collecting and hiding in her cellar. "This is what you've been calling donkey feed," she told them, her voice steady. "But it's the only thing that's going to get you to spring." The men were skeptical, even disgusted. To eat the food of the wild was seen as a loss of civilization. But hunger is a powerful teacher. Margaret showed them how to boil the pods into a thick, protein-rich syrup and how to roast the seeds into something resembling coffee. For 2 months, the Sullivan Roadhouse became an experimental laboratory for survival. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, the massive King Ranch was losing 500 head of cattle a day. The owners, following government best practices, refused to let their hands harvest the local sage and yucca for emergency fodder, fearing it would taint the meat for the Chicago markets. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. By the time the thaws came in March, the big ranches were graveyards of bleached bones. The turning point was undeniable. The civilized methods of the East had been crushed by the reality of the West. Margaret Sullivan's ragtag group of travelers walked out of that roadhouse alive and strong. Elias Thorne, over in Kansas, had managed to keep his small herd of 3 cows alive by mixing his secret dried grass into their meager hay. The word was out. You couldn't conquer the West with a gun if you didn't know how to eat the ground you stood on. The government responded with a final, desperate move. In 1878, a federal decree was issued in several territories that made it illegal to harvest wild forage on public lands without a permit. They called it resource protection. But the settlers knew what it really was, a final attempt to control the menu of the frontier. The decade following the Great Winter of 1876 saw a radical transformation of the American landscape. The Garden War didn't end with a peace treaty. It ended with the slow, agonizing erasure of traditional knowledge. As the railroads finally connected the smallest dusty outposts to the giant mills of Minneapolis and the stockyards of Chicago, the pressure to conform became overwhelming. The government's victory over the wilderness was marketed in every newspaper. They promised that the days of scavenging like animals were over. With the arrival of cheap white flour and canned goods, the hard-won secrets of Elias Thorne and Margaret Sullivan began to gather dust. By 1885, the very plants that had saved Sarah Thorne's life were officially reclassified in agricultural handbooks as noxious weeds. The United States Department of Agriculture began a systematic campaign to purify the plains. They introduced chemical sprays and promoted deep plowing techniques that turned the complex, root-heavy sod into a uniform sea of wheat. The diverse Indian grasses were replaced by a single strain of grain that required massive amounts of water that the West simply didn't have. The consequences were felt almost immediately in the health of the settlers. As they moved away from the nutrient-dense wild forage and onto a diet of processed flour, sugar, and salted pork, the frontier stamina began to fade. Documents from fort infirmaries in the late 1880s show a massive spike in digestive ailments and general wasting among the civilian population. They were eating more, but they were nourished less. The Native American tribes felt the aftermath even more severely. As they were pushed onto reservations, the government strictly prohibited the gathering of wild tubers and seeds outside of designated zones. This wasn't just about land. It was about breaking their independence. A person who can find a meal in a dry ravine is hard to control. A person who depends on a government flour ration is not. The botanical cleansing of the West was a silent partner to the military campaigns. 10 years after his midnight ride into the ravine, Elias Thorne sold his farm. The soil was played out, the local agent said. The deep plowing had allowed the wind to carry away the topsoil that the wild grasses had protected for thousands of years. Elias moved his family further west, but he carried a small, leather pouch of those original seeds with him, not to plant, but as a reminder. He wrote in a letter to his brother, quote, "They tell us we have tamed the land with the plow, but I look at the dust in the air and I fear we have only killed the thing that was keeping us alive." Today, many of these prohibited plants have made a strange comeback. What Margaret Sullivan called coward's coffee, the roasted mesquite bean, is now sold in high-end health food stores as a superfood with a low glycemic index. The purslane that farmers were fined for growing is now prized by chefs for its high omega-3 content. We are rediscovering, at a premium price, the very things we spent a century trying to eradicate with fire and law. So what became of the people who knew the truth? Elias Thorne lived to be 84. He saw the dawn of the 20th century and the first automobiles rattling across the Kansas plains. It is said that in his final years, he kept a small, untidy garden at the back of his house in town. While his neighbors competed for the greenest, most uniform lawns, Elias grew a patch of wild blue grama and prickly succulents. To the townspeople, it was an eyesore. To Elias, it was a monument to the summer Sarah didn't die. Margaret Sullivan's roadhouse eventually burned down in 1892, but her legacy lived on in the local folklore of New Mexico. For generations, local ranchers in that specific county survived the worst droughts by following her secret methods of processing cactus fruit, long after the big cattle syndicates had gone bankrupt and fled back east. The Wild West was never truly conquered by the flash of a muzzle or the speed of a horse. It was settled by the quiet endurance of those who looked at a weed and saw a meal. It was won by the women who kept seeds sewn into the hems of their skirts and the men who were willing to risk a guard's bullet for a handful of wild roots. The numbers tell the final story. Of the millions of cattle that perished during the expansion, nearly 70% died from starvation or related diseases, not from predators or conflict. The greatest enemy of the pioneer was not the outlaw, but the hunger that came when the Eastern dreams met the Western reality. We often think of history as a series of great battles and political speeches. But history is also written in the soil. It's written in the plants we choose to cherish and the ones we choose to hate. The next time you see a tough, yellow-flowered weed pushing its way through a crack in a dry sidewalk, remember Elias Thorne. Remember that what we call useless today was the only thing that kept the American dream from starving to death 150 years ago. The West wasn't just a place you lived. It was a place that taught you what it truly means to survive.